So before you start, I wanted to say something about what happened in Brazil. I wanted to mention that Evandro was so kind to give me a copy of this book that was co-written by him and by Itala, who are going to give this presentation right now. In this volume, it was published for the first time, among many other things, the letter that Miró Quesada wrote to Newton da Costa, suggesting the name of paraconsistent logic.
And this book, it will be presented in one of the slides. Is a huge, a big research project towards the history of paraconsistency and paraconsistent logic. This project, this research, started with my PhD thesis. We are advised by Professor Itala, Professor D'Ottaviano, and we are working on this about 15 years, I suppose, because we started to work in the theme about 2008, 7 or 8, with a strict focus on the research. So in 2013, in December, I have finished my PhD. Jean-Yves Beziot, Otávio Bueno, Newton da Costa, Décio Krause, Ricardo Tassinari, Fábio Bertato. I think I don't forget anyone.
Yes.
Or in the jury, and since then we are working to publish the material. In 2017, we achieved the publication in Portuguese, which corresponds to the book Para Além das Colunas de Hércules, Beyond on the Pillars of Hercules. And in parallel, we are working since then, but after 2017, we are working in enhanced translation to the volume with a lot of new parts into the English. This part of the project is intended to be an issue of a Science Library book series by Springer. Então, esse é um projeto grande que começou em 2007, 2008, na minha pesquisa para o doutorado, orientada, né, pela professora Itala D'Ottaviano, na Unicamp, aqui no Brasil, em Campinas, no Centro de Lógica, Epistemologia e História da Ciência. E nós trabalhamos desde essa época, né, no tema. O trabalho é extenso, há muitas dificuldades de vários tipos. Em 2017, nós conseguimos, enfim, publicar a tradução, a versão brasileira, né, uma versão em português. Alguns colegas aqui da América Latina, de outros países, de vários continentes, nós já enviamos exemplares, né, do livro, mas é claro que o alcance em língua portuguesa é pequeno, porque é preciso saber espanhol e português, né, ou português, para que seja possível uma leitura proveitosa, né? Como eu tinha dito antes, em 2013, então, o doutorado foi concluído, nós trabalhamos mais 2, 3 anos e submetemos a publicação aqui no Brasil. E desde 2015, mas em paralelo à publicação brasileira, nós estamos trabalhando numa versão inglesa do volume, com capítulos novas entrevistas ao final do volume. Então, um material assim que vai ficar um pouco maior até do que já é, né, em torno de 1000 páginas. Y estamos trabajando en eso en ese momento.
Sí, ¿aló? ¿Me escuchan?
Sí.
Bueno, un saludo especial en español para todos los participantes. Estoy muy contento de estar con ustedes aquí y vamos a disfrutar estos días de Festival de la Lógica, 4 días en Perú. Un abrazo.
Gracias, Cifuentes.
Me gustaría agradecer a los organizadores, en especial en la persona de Luis Felipe, por la invitación y por la alegría de estar participando de esta primera, creo, sesión in the World Logic Day 2021. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to participate in this Peruvian, organized from Peru, World Logic Day. And I would like to emphasize the relevance of logic, that is the most beautiful and important science as the science of reasoning. And my message in this so sad moment, the pandemic that humanity is living, I would like to say that I hope that we logicians continue believing in science. And in Latin America, in special the case of my country, Brazil, I hope that we continue fighting for best days. Let's begin. Evandro, the next one. Our talk was prepared, especially prepared, dedicated to the memory of Francisco Miró Quesada Cantuarias. Next. The present state of paraconsistent logic attests to significant enhancement, and its maturity permits a critical historical analysis of its development, having in view the appreciation of its historical roots and stages of formation. The aim of our general research project, or mine and Evandro's project, the main of our general research project, to which this talk belongs, consists in studying how a truly paraconsistent perspective developed in Western thought, as well as how logical principles, rules, and axiomatic logical systems have expressed the contemporary various aspects of paraconsistency. In this talk, we present and analyze the main known historical events concerning the creation of the word paraconsistent, as well as its introduction as the name for inconsistent but non-trivial formal systems. Evandro? Part of this talk has previously appeared in section 433 of our just mentioned book, Para Além das Colunas de Hércules, uma história da paraconsistência, de Heráclito Newton da Costa, published in Portuguese in 2017. The title in English of the book is Beyond the Columns of Hercules, A History of Paraconsistency, from Heraclitus to Newton da Costa. During the talk, it will be clear why the name Para Além das Colunas de Hércules, Beyond the Columns of Hercules. The book was published by the Unicamp University Press and Coleção Clé of the Center for Logic. It was published as a volume celebrating the 50 years of the University of Campinas. The book has more or less 700 pages, and an enhanced and extended English version of the book will be published by Santesi Library Book Series. We are in the final stages of writing the book because it extends the Portuguese version. It will have a little more than 1,000 pages. And the title of the book will be Illuminating Contradiction, A History of Paraconsistence from Heraclitus of Ephesus to Newton da Costa. Following? The outline of our talk is, after a short introduction, we will present and discuss the famous correspondence between Newton da Costa and Miró Quesada. And we'll discuss some questions, for instance, the observation given by Walter Carnielli, because he has not read the correspondence, probably, because the answer to his question is in the correspondence. Then we will discuss the introducing paraconsistent logic and paraconsistency into the word. Evandro will discuss the etymological roots of the terms, and then I will present some final remarks. Let's begin. Let's begin by some basic definitions. In the introduction, we will present some basic definitions and basic comments. Let's recall a theory whose underlying language has a symbol for negation is inconsistent if there is a formula of its language such that the formula and its negation are both theorems of the theory. Otherwise, the theory is called consistent. A theory is trivial if all formulas of its language are theorems. If the underlying logic of theory is classical logic or another standard logic such as intuitionistic logic, inconsistency entails triviality and conversely. A logical system is paraconsistent if it can be the underlying logic for inconsistent but non-trivial theories, which are called paraconsistent theories. This is the definition presented by Newton da Costa since his first papers, his first works on the subject. In accordance with the practice of da Costa, Bueno, and Krause, discussed in the reference, or use of the terms consistency and inconsistency is syntactical according to the original mathematical terminology of Hilbert and his school. Some basic considerations about paraconsistent logics, very important. They underlie the fundamental characteristics of paraconsistency. In paraconsistent logics, the scope of the principle of non-contradiction is, in a certain sense, restricted. In every paraconsistent logic, from a formula and its negation, it is not possible in general to deduce any formula of the language. In paraconsistent logics, the notions of inconsistency and triviality are, in fact, independent notions. In paraconsistent logics, the principle ex falso sequitur quodlibet is not valid in general. So, according to the question just presented by Peter, paraconsistent logics are non-classical logics, a kind of non-classical logic. Let's speak a little about the ex falso because it is the important feature underlying paraconsistent logic. The ex falso has some variants in the history of logic. Ex falso sequitur quodlibet, ex impossibilis sequitur quodlibet, ex contradictionis sequitur quodlibet, and nowadays, usually it's called principle of explosion. We have looked for the analysis concerning the ex falso in the literature, in special in the medieval times. And we have several mentions of the principle with different names and objectives. And motivated by a historical analysis, in special by the discussions on the ex falso held by several thinkers during the Middle Ages, though we recognize these distinct logical nuances, we consider the expression ex falso sequitur quodlibet to embrace such principles as special types of the ex falso. As far as we know, according to our heavy research, the first thinker to use the expression idem esse ex contradictione that is a weaker form of the ex contradictione sequitur quodlibet, the first thinker was John of Salisbury, alluding to Adam of Balsham's school, the parvipontani, the non-parvipontani, alluding to Adam of Balsham's school position in the debate. Here is the reference about John of Salisbury. Also, as far as we know, it was Mortensen, in his known book Inconsistent Mathematics, published in 1996, who used in the context of paraconsistency the expression ex contradictione quodlibet in the context of paraconsistency. Bobenhirt, Andres, who is here, in 1996 used the expression ex contradictione sequitur quodlibet in his master dissertation and the book he has published in 1996. Next. Dalla Chiara, Maria Luisa Dalla Chiara, mentioned the principle as ex absurdo sequitur quodlibet in his book Logica, published in 1974. But we have found that in fact this expression ex contradictione sequitur quodlibet had been previously used in the literature by several other logicians. As an example, we have a book From Axiom to Dialogue, published in 1982 by Barth and Krabbe, where they discuss the principle and call it ex contradictione sequitur quodlibet. Following? However, the study of inconsistent but non-trivial theories and of the deductive systems underlying such theories was practiced for some time from the 60s into the 70s without a suitable name being attributed to it. Until an appropriate name was finally proposed, theorists involved in the investigation of these systems simply referred to them as logics of inconsistent formal systems. The birth certificate of paraconsistent logic was drawn up in a letter from the Peruvian philosopher Francisco Miró Quesada Cantuarias, the proposer of the name, to Newton da Costa, one of the creators of modern paraconsistent logic. In the abundant correspondence between them, the letter dated September 29, 1975, is especially remarkable. In this notable letter, Miró Quesada begins by expressing great contentment over da Costa's having invited him to come the following year to the University of Campinas, Unicamp, in Brazil, São Paulo, to participate in the 3rd Latin American Symposium on Mathematical Logic. However, Quesada was even more satisfied to be able to respond to his friend's request that he find a name for the logics of inconsistent and non-trivial formal systems. As noted earlier, a suitable name for the theory of inconsistent and non-trivial formal systems was needed in order to clearly express the theoretical position of its advocates and thereby favor its understanding and acceptance within the logical, mathematical, philosophical community. Newton da Costa relates how this came about, in a paper he published in the volume La Filosofia della Logica de Francisco Miró Quesada Cantuarias, in Lógica, Razón y Humanismo, la obra filosófica de Francisco Miró Quesada, published in 1992. Newton says, "It was then that I wrote to Miró Quesada, who viewed the new logic with great enthusiasm, asking him to suggest a name for it. I remember, if it were today, that he responded by making 3 proposals. It could be called metaconsistent, ultraconsistent, or paraconsistent. After commenting on these possible names, he stated that he found the latter to be the best. For me, the word paraconsistent sounded splendid, and I began to use it insisting also that all interested parties do the same. In his mentioned letter to Da Costa, Miró Quesada argued in sequence for his 3 suggestions. In presenting the first of them, Evandro, you could speak this part, okay?
Okay. So in the letter, Quesadas make 3 suggestions, and the first is the following assert. In presenting the first of them, Quesada says, "I'm very pleased to hear from you about the name that could be given to the logic of inconsistent systems. It is a problem that would be easy if it were not for the pernicious semantic load of the words. I think the ideal name is ultra-consistent logics, because ultra in Latin means beyond. Remember the pillars of Hercules, non plus ultra, and the motto of the colonizers, or the pioneers, I don't know. Plus ultra, that is, beyond of columns of Hercules." And the Miró Quesada goes on his suggestion, addressing the role of Newton da Costa in the history of logic. "You are a colonizer of logic, a pioneer of explorer of logic, because you have exceeded consistency. You have created a logic that goes beyond consistency, as it can be applied to both consistent and inconsistent systems, avoiding trivialization in the last case. The bad thing is that ultra is used today as synonymous with an extremely intense increase of equality. So ultra-consistent logic gives the impression of being a logic that has an extraordinary consistency and anointed and consecrated consistency. So this is the first suggestion in the Quesada's letter. The metaphor here evoked by Miró Quesada is admirable. Newton da Costa has gone beyond the Herculean pillars of logic, Hercules, logici, Hercules columni, that is, beyond the consistency, extending the limits of noun logicity and reestablishing them through paraconsistent logic. The image evoked here by Miró Quesada comes from Greek mythology. Hercules, in carrying out his 10th labor, bringing the oxen of the monster Geryon to King Eurystheus, traveled to the island of Erythea in the far west of the Mediterranean. As a memorial of his passage, according to some versions of the myth, Hercules erected 2 mountains, one in Africa and the other in Europe. The first being Mount Acho in Ceuta, or alternatively Mount Musa in Morocco, the second being the Rock of Gibraltar. Here we have a picture of the Strait of Gibraltar to recover the beautiful image that Quesadas calls in the letter. In another version of the myth, the Greek hero split the mountain in the middle, giving birth to the Strait of Gibraltar, and thus connecting the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. The pillars of Hercules were considered for centuries by the maritime peoples of the Mediterranean world to be the limits of navigation. Like the navigators of the Age of Exploration, Newton da Costa has traversed the columns of Hercules, the former traveling to a new land, the latter towards new perspectives of logic. The second suggestion of Quesada.
Evandro, may I
Yes.
give an observation? When we read the so poetic letter, the so poetic test by Miró Quesada, do you remember? We immediately decided to give the name to our book, Para Além das Colunas de Hércules, Beyond. Here is the explication of the title of the book.
Yes,
concerning the title of the book.
Very well remembered. And some people, I know that some people, the publisher has shared with us that some people sometimes think that the book is a book on mythology because of the title. But there are a description, subtitles explaining what the subject matter of the book deals with.
In the introduction, there is we explicit in the introduction of the book.
Yeah, and I think the book and this history couldn't be a better name. It's very beautiful, this metaphor, and very sensitive to the incorporate to employ this beautiful image to Quesada's suggestion. We adapt the title of the book for Quesada's. The second suggestion made by Quesada's is this one. He says, for this reason, perhaps it would be better to say meta-consistent logics, because meta means beyond or after in Greek. That is more or less the same thing as ultra. It also means other things with different grammatical cases. It also sounds very nice. It is true that it's a barbarism or rather a solecism, but this doesn't matter because sociology is also. The defect of meta-consistent is that meta is associated in the mathematical philosophical milieu with meta theory and gives the impression that it's a logic related to meta language. But aside from this semantic phrase, I would not see any objection. So this is the second suggestion by Quesada. Finally, the third suggestion, like in the previous suggestion, it also suffers semantic interference from more consolidated uses of the prefix. Miró Quesada then suggests the name that would be destined to travel the world and accurately translate the very spirit of logics of inconsistent and non-trivial formal systems. Here this is the third suggestion by Quesada. There is, he says, there is, however, another possibility. Use para, which in Greek means next to. Paraconsistent logics sounds nice, a little esoteric, gives a more or less precise idea of what it is about. Logics that are not like the classical ones, but that fall next to them, as they can be applied to inconsistent systems, and has the advantage that there is no deforming semantic load. I therefore propose that you choose from the three following names, whose precision is due to their negative semantic load. The first, ultra-consistent logics, meta-consistent logics, paraconsistent logics. I hope that you like any of the three, and I would be happy to have contributed to baptizing these types of logic that have such great philosophical importance. This is undoubtedly the first time in history that the term paraconsistent was written. Miró Quesada's letter is therefore a primary source unique to the history of paraconsistent logic and may be said to constitute the baptismal certificate of paraconsistent logic. The latter is archived in the historical archives of the Centre for Logic and Epistemology and the History of Science of the University of Campinas. It belongs to the Newton da Costa's fund of documents, and from then we have access to this primary source. The choice of the name contributed greatly to the effort to establish and legitimize this area of logical formal research. Here we have we are presenting the page 1 of the letter. It's a bit teeny, but maybe you can amplify, magnify the image to see the authentic letter. It's a very important piece of history of paraconsistent logic. Here in this page 1, we have in the final, the second paragraph, we have the first suggestion by Quesada. In the page, you have to read. I can wait. You try to see the document. Maybe
we could go ahead, and then if somebody would like to read it, we could return after the talk.
Okay. The second page, we have the other two, the second and the third suggestions for a name. And in the letter, Paco, Quesadas are dealing with Newton about the details of the invitation to the third Latin American Symposium on Mathematical Logic to be held in the next year, in the time of the events. The name was made finally public in the important Continental Logic event, the third Latin American Symposium on Mathematical Logic. Such continental event has held at the Institute of Mathematics, Statistics, and Computer Science, IMEC. Nowadays, the Institute of Mathematics, Statistics, and Scientific Computation at the University of Campinas, Unicamp, from 11 to 7 July, 11 to 17 in 1976. Itala was in the event. He is a witness of the
he was a Newton's student.
Yeah.
Okay, here is Aida Ruda, who also was my close friend and teacher. At the third Latin American Symposium on Mathematical Logic, organized by Aida Inês Arruda, and the first of these symposiums to be held at Unicamp, Quesada lectured on heterodox logics and the problem of the unit of logic. Nowadays, several people work on the plurality of logics, and Quesada spoke about that in 1976. It was in this lecture that he made public the suggestion of the names paraconsistent logic and paraconsistency. Here is the photo of the opening session of the event, from right to left. The first one is Aida Ruda. The second one, Rolando Chuaki from Chile, a close friend of Newton da Costa too. Ubiratã D'Ambrosio, the director of the Institute of Mathematics, who always gave great possibilities to the logicians, and he respected too much Newton da Costa and Aida Ruda. Aside Ubiratã D'Ambrosio is Joseph Schoenfeld, who was the president of the Association for Symbolic Logic. Next, Newton da Costa, and the last one, Paco Miró Quesada. During the event itself, Elias Humberto Alves and Carlos Alberto Lungarzo had already used the term paraconsistent in their communications on paraconsistent logic and a paraconsistent infinitary propositional calculus, respectively. The proceedings of the Third Islam, titled Non-Classical Logics, Model Theory and Computability, were published in 1977 by North Holland, edited by Aida Huda, Newton da Costa, and Rolando Schwacke. But the lecture delivered by Quesada and the communications presented by Alves and Lungarzo are not in the book, for they were not sent by the authors for publication. Here is a photo of the participants during the event. We see in the first line, Schoenfeld, to the left, Schwacke, Aida Huda, two officers of Unicamp, Fraissé, Miró Quesada. We can see that he has a newspaper. Every day, I remember him reading the newspaper, from São Paulo and other countries. Over there, after Newton da Costa, Roberto Signoli, to the left, Luiz Monteiro, Krasner, Luiz Paulo de Alcântara, to the top, Lopes Escobar, Ubiratã D'Ambrosio. I'm hidden.
Asenjo.
Where is Asenjo? Alonso Asenjo.
You.
I'm in front of Alonso Asenjo.
And you?
A little hidden. Okay, the next. The next slide. Da Costa describes a phenomenon unique in the history of logic. 2 or 3 months later, the miracle took place. The term circled the world, and all centers directly or indirectly linked to logic in the northern and southern hemispheres began to use it. I think that very few times in the history of science, and certainly in the history of logic, has anything similar happened, because not only did the word travel the whole world, but the logic itself, that Miró Quesada called paraconsistent, gained a formidable impulse. It became one of the most debated logical theories of all time. Quesada's suggestion of employing the preposition para, taken from Attic Greek, was absolutely successful. Evandro?
It's incredible that Quesada's huge culture was the right person, and that made an ingenious suggestion for a construction of a name that could embrace some nuances of meaning. In ancient Greek, para explains Muratio, a very important Greek scholar from Brazil, for example, but in other reference grammars of Greek, you can find the same description. Ancient Greek make uses of invariable words, prepositions. Initially are 18 proper propositions, which before verbs add to the verbal meaning, which are words that express action or state, a spatial relationship, and by metaphor, a temporal relation. Para, the original meaning, we can say for para means next to, in complete opposition to the idea of within. The original concrete meaning of para, explains Muratio, is next to or along with, as Quesada pointed out above, and its meanings varies in accord with the grammatical case of its object. For example, we have a para in dative case. When the object is in dative case, para can have the meaning at the side of, as in the following example. Oi para Basile ontes. That means those who are aside the king. Those who are aside the king, what is the court, the olix, the closest to the king. So in the dative case, this is the meaning of para. Para means aside, at the side of. By the way, in the accusative case, when the object is in the accusative case, para means can have the meaning of beyond, as in the following example. Cai para dinamim. That means even beyond his power, stand aside, surpassing. These are the etymological roots that allow the term paraconsistent to encompass distinct philosophical visions, perceptions, conceptions of paraconsistency, from the most sober to the most exaggerated. Some scholars, such as Asenjo, consider the name ignorable, while others suggested alternative names, such as dialectic logic, suggested by Priest and Houtley, transconsistent logic, suggested by Priest, para inconsistent logic by Perjanovsky. These suggestions, however, did not go anywhere, probably due to the great semantic capacity of the term paraconsistent. The term very well translates the logical character of inconsistent, contradictory, but non-trivial logics, while at the same time it is capable of harboring diverse philosophical visions of the ontological study of contradiction. Several important and recognized, Itala?
Okay, let's finalize with our final remarks. It's important to recognize logicians from various countries participated as invited speakers in the third Latin American Symposium on Mathematical Logic in 1976, as we have mentioned, held at the University of Campinas. From Latin America and Brazil, alongside Arruda, Newton Costa, Orlando Schwach, Roberto Signoli, and Miró Quesada, among others. There also participated in the event young logicians who are nowadays well-known points of reference in Latin American logic, Brazilians and non-Brazilians. I, D'Ottaviano, when then a doctoral student, I witnessed the atmosphere of effusive revelry and acceptance that accompanied Quesada's lecture and suggestion of the term paraconsistent logic. I remember quite well. In 1989, I participated also in the first World Congress on Paraconsistency held in Ghent, Belgium, when Jerzy Perjanowski, the Polish logician, publicly proposed the alternative name para-inconsistent logic for the paraconsistent systems. He claimed and discussed it and expressed his opinion. He tried to explain why para-inconsistent would be better than paraconsistent. I also participated in the case as invited speaker in the Jaskowski Memorial Symposium held in Torun, Poland in 1998, when Perjanowski once again presented his proposal. And I remember quite well, my English was very, very poor, but I publicly protested and argued against Perjanowski's suggestion. Although we do not have the letter from Da Costa, the first letter asking Quesada for suggestions for name for the inconsistent but non-trivial systems. Although we do not have the letter, we didn't find it. Probably it is in the archives left by Miró Quesada. We don't have the letter responding, but the letter from Da Costa that Quesada was responding to, Da Costa talked about the event and the discussion in a book honoring the year of his Peruvian French correspondent. Da Costa says, several years ago, when I needed a convenient and meaningful name for a logic that did not from the start eliminate contradictions as false, that is, as absolutely unacceptable, Miró Quesada told me, on this point, it should be remembered that at that time, all logics truly condemn contradictions. The new logic in which I worked, therefore, still found a great deal of resistance. It was little publicized, and those who were aware of it were, for the most part, skeptical about it. Da Costa's account shows how difficult the early days of paraconsistent logic were. If today, paraconsistency is a theoretical option among many alternatives, at the time it was first proposed, in its beginnings, it was necessary for the pioneers of paraconsistency to overcome resistance in order for the new perspective on logicity to be legitimately admitted. Both from the theoretical and paradigmatic points of view, it was necessary for paraconsistent logic to be accepted as valid by the community of those who studied logic. On this point, the name paraconsistent seems to have played a key role. With regard to the choice of the name and to Quesada's suggestion of the term paracomplete, he also suggested the term paracomplete. Newton proposed it internationally, but we discovered that Quesada also proposed to Newton da Costa the term paracomplete for describing those logics, duals, two paraconsistent duals, in which the principle of the excluded third does not hold. Da Costa states, very beautiful, Quesada and Da Costa are very poetic. It does not seem to me an exaggeration to say that in these two episodes, the name created the thing named. Is this not a miracle? Or, if someone prefers, an act of magic? As the answer has to be positive, the appellation of magician should be applied to Miró Quesada. The next, please. Evandro?
Yes.
The next slide.
It's presented. It's
not in the screen. Today, Newton da Costa looks back on these events and recognizes once again their importance. I think the name is fundamental. When Professor Miró Quesada, a great friend of mine, a Peruvian, suggested this name, in a matter of months, the whole world was talking about paraconsistent logic. In this case, the name almost created the discipline. In fact, he was a full professor at the Faculty of Law there at the University of San Marcos, and perhaps the first book on juridical logic in Latin America was written by him. Francisco Miró Quesada suggested to Newton da Costa a non-embracing name for inconsistent but non-trivial formal systems. And in spite of other proposals, the term paraconsistent prevailed. Miró Quesada, in presenting his master's touch to the international academic community during the third Latin American Symposium on Mathematical Logic, ineradicably left his mark on the history of paraconsistency and paraconsistent logic. Tribute to Newton and Paco. This photo of Newton was taken 1 year ago, more or less, when he received the title of Emeritus Professor at the Federal University of Paraná. Evandro and I were there. Gracias. Obrigada. Obrigado.
Gracias.
Thank you, Itala, for such a wonderful talk. Thank you, Evandro. So now we can have a little talk about this. I'm sure some of you will want to say something about it. So one thing I wanted to comment, perhaps before anybody else speaks, is some kind of a note about one term that is used in this letter, which is colónida.
Yeah.
He says to Newton, and probably you are wondering, what is this word? What word is this? I am not quite sure, because the word does not exist in Spanish. The word colónida is not a Spanish word. And as far as I am concerned, it's not a word in any Latin language. But in Peru, there was a literary movement called colónida. I don't know if perhaps, well, I'm sure Francisco Miró Quesada knew about it, because he was he knew a lot about literature. But I am not sure how could that reference have gotten into Newton da Costa. It's very weird. Maybe Francisco Miró Quesada told Newton da Costa in one occasion about this literary movement, and I am looking for a specific quote, which is the idea of the colónidas is that they were. Here it is. So in explanatory notes to this letter, I put the following: that with the word colónida, Miró Quesada probably refers to the Peruvian literary movement colónidas, which was developed between 1915 and 1916. This movement conceived itself as, and I quote here, a sequel to Columbus' work afoot in a new world, that of the new literature. This is said by Luis Alberto Sanchez, a Peruvian writer and thinker. In the preface, he writes to a compilation of writings of several authors of this movement. Now, it's very, very weird that Miró Quesada made that reference to Newton da Costa, because it is a very cryptic Peruvian reference that it has been lost a long time ago, and well, probably not at that time, but I'm not sure that it transcended the frontiers of even Lima, that movement. But well, I wanted to make just that historical note. Cifuentes has a book in there.
Colónida.
And maybe we could ask Newton da Costa about this.
Yes.
If they have discussed this. This could be a very interesting thing.
Yes.
But it's very beautiful, the correspondence. I think it's so poetic, so instigating, so motivating. Don't you think?
Luis,
Yes.
I thank a lot your explanation about colónida, because we have searched in dictionaries and vocabularies, and I had noted in the some years ago that it was not a classified word of Spanish. So the idea maybe seems clear in the paragraph, but the word was a mystery because it's not a colonizer. It's a person who are exploring, who are expanding the world. Maybe this idea was the goal of what Quesada wants to say to Da Costa, and we will be very interesting to share the translation. We would like to ask you, Peruvian and others, to help us to improve the English translation of some key words in the letter, in order to have a very truly a very faithful translation in English. And another thing I would like to remark is that this presentation is the first time I know, as far I know, that we are openly presenting publicly, making public the letter in a Congress presentation. And it is very proper because some people started to invent stories about the lack of a document. And so I think this is very important today to show the document, to show the Quesada's words, and to do justice to the fact that Newton da Costa is one of the creators of paraconsistent logic, and he is the responsible for the provocation to Quesada's think about a name, and the name make all difference after all research that has been done since then in paraconsistency.
So Andrés asked the word, but before you, I wanted to invite Cifuentes to comment a little bit. Cifuentes, no sé si podrías comentarnos un poco, ya que tienes el libro Colónidas por ahí.
Bueno, yo no sabía, voy a hablar en español, yo no sabía de Miró Quesada sobre Colónida, pero lo que yo tengo es un facsimilar, porque Colónida apareció como una revista.
Sí.
De varios números durante un par de años.
Efectivamente.
En las dos primeras décadas del siglo XX. Entonces yo tengo esa edición facsimilar de las revistas Colónida. Yo no sabía de esa mención de Miró Quesada sobre el nombre o algo así.
Antes de continuar, antes de darle la palabra a Andrés, justo he compartido por el chat tanto la carta de Miró Quesada original que han mostrado ustedes en la ponencia, como la actual versión de la traducción al inglés. So I have shared the version of this letter of Miró Quesada in a translation in English for those who cannot read Spanish. I have also shared the Spanish version of the letter. So Andrés, please, you can talk.
Okay. Thank you, Luis Felipe. Thank you very much, Itala, for the nice talk, and Evandro. It's really interesting to see all these details. And I didn't remember this Colónida word, so it's very interesting to see what was the meaning in that moment and how far, in which sense it can be referred similar to something that happened with paraconsistent logic. But I have to thank especially for the reference to my using of the name of in contradictiones sequitur quod libet. And this is a moment I think is important to make it clear historically, because I didn't explain much in my book that, and afterwards there have been many things about that. Names, the names used for this purpose. So the first thing I learned, two things here today, probably is because I haven't read your book properly in that sense. The first one is that there was this, in the books of Meyer, was the use of in ex contradictione quod libet. I didn't know until this moment that Meyer used that. I assumed that there was Priest who used that name in his book In Contradiction in 1987. But thank you for you to point that was Meyer who coined that term of ex contradiction.
Yes, not Meyer, it was Mortensen.
Sorry, Mortensen, yes, in the book of consistent mathematics. So I learned that, thank you very much. And the other thing about the using of the term by me, I have to point out that at the moment that I wrote that, I was doing my master thesis and I didn't have the book from Priest. And that's very important. I put it in the bibliography of the book to make it more extensive, but at that time we don't get the books in English so easily. So at that time I didn't have the book from Priest and no reference from the Mortensen. So in my thesis was I thinking about what could be a good name. And that the difference is only one word, that's sequitur. And I think the sequitur is very good to say in ex contradictione sequitur quod libet. I think the sequitur is very important because it points to the logical element of that. The Latin element, I studied Latin in my university. Ex contradictione is a case, I don't remember exactly what I studied, or I don't remember what that makes from contradictions. So I think it's quite interesting, but I use that name without knowing the other names. And what I'm amazed now is that you have shown that someone in 1886 has used it. Before that, I didn't know until today, and I'm very glad that this name is used in different ways, but I didn't know the use of that name. I think more than who point the name is which name is best, and I still think that ex contradictione sequitur quod libet is a very good name. The principle of explosion is good. I think it's good, but it's more explains more in English. But the other thing is, and as you have pointed, I thought if we put a Latin name, it will be better because people will think there's an old name that is all the time there. And of course, it's just a move from ex falso, ex negation. But it's interesting, the name, the Latin name that became like a coin several centuries ago. But that's two historical points. But very thank you for making me that and let me know that there was the use of this term before that. But I didn't know when I published it. Otherwise, I would have put a reference in both cases to Priest and to or Mortensen, even though, and to this other guy that you're quoting. Just want to comment on that. And thank you for the nice talk.
So, somebody else wants to?
Yes. I want to.
Yes.
I've already put it in the chat. So I'm Peter, and my question I've put in the chat. Two questions, in fact. Question one: if we could say it is the parallel postulate that distinguishes Euclidean from non-Euclidean mathematics, in fact, mathematics and logic, what axioms, postulates, theorems, etc. may be said to distinguish classical logic from paraconsistent logic? And the second question, is paraconsistent logic more or less consistent than classical logic? But the first question, if you could give an answer to this, it would be great. Maybe we don't agree on all the axioms of, for instance, third order logic, but maybe still you can say this statement is very important. We can consider it to distinguish the classical systems from the paraconsistent system.
Evandro, would you like to reply, or could I reply?
Could you?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't hear it. Yeah.
Thanks for the questions. They are very important. Let's begin by the first one. The idea is exactly that. The correspondence between non-classical logics.
Mathematics should be, sorry, mathematics, sorry.
Yeah, no, okay, I'm going there. The first papers, the forerunners of paraconsistent logics, we have work about that. Vasiliev and Lukashevich, they explicitly claim that they are motivated by the creation of non-Euclidean geometries. By
geometry,
Okay, and they claim that as the mathematicians in geometry decided not to accept the fifth Euclidean axioms, they could do something similar relative to classical logic in order to have maybe special logics, not equivalent to classical logic. Then the idea is Lukashevich began and Vasiliev claiming that they could not agree with the general validity of the principle of non-contradiction.
Okay.
And so at the beginning, it seemed that Lukashevich would create a logic in which the principle of non-contradiction would not be valid. But in 1920, when he presents his talk related to the creation of many-valued logics, the axiom that was not valid was in fact the third excluded middle.
Excluded middle.
Yes. And then he created a kind of paracomplete logic, not paraconsistent. Paracomplete according to the term used by Newton and Quesada. Many-valued logics, intuitionistic logics, are logics in which the principle of the excluded middle is not valid. Paraconsistent logics are logics in which the principle of contradiction is not valid in general. But you says, how is the axiomatic? Nowadays, we have many systems, distinct systems of paraconsistent logics. For instance, all the systems of relevance logics with distinct motivation. In the relevant logics or relevance logics, the ex falso is not valid. And so they are, relevant logics are paraconsistent, lato sensu. But
what is ex falso in English? Is that?
So from the false, everything follows. From A and not A implies not A implies B. A and not A implies B, whatever B. From the contradiction or from the false, you may have any formula whatsoever. And so this is the idea of claiming, of calling the principle nowadays as explosion, please. As said, Andres, I don't like the name. It seems like a war, like a bomb.
Yeah.
But I don't like the idea. I prefer peace. In peace. Okay. When Newton da Costa introduced his systems in 1963, the first systems deeply studied in the literature, he began introducing the language, the symbols for negation, disjunction, conjunction, implication, because they are not interdefinable. They are independent connectives. There begins the difference. His systems, he began by introducing as axioms, the axioms of intuitionistic positive logic. And then he puts not A implies A. After he considered that it could put the equivalence. And then he defines a special connective. He called a ball connective, called the connective of good behavior. This connective says a formula is well behaved by definition if it is not the case of A and not A. The negation is the primitive negation of the language. And so in the language, you have the formulas in general, and the well-behaved formula. What do you mean by well-behaved if you think? The formulas which behave consistently, classically. And then he has the axioms. The following axiom says, give a kind of reductio ad absurdum, reduction to absurdum, only for well-behaved formula. If A is well-behaved, and it's the case, if A is well-behaved, and it is the case of A and not A, then you imply B, any B. And so you have the ex falso, or the explosion, only if you are primarily dealing with well-behaved formulas. And then he has some special axioms that are called the propagation of well-behavedness. If A is well-behaved, not A is well-behaved. If A and B are well-behaved, then the conjunction of them, the disjunction, and the conditional are well-behaved. And so, based on these first axioms given by Newton da Costa, several other paraconsistent systems have been offered, introduced. And so, even in these first systems, Newton has his primitive and basic negation, the connective, the paraconsistent negation, but he introduces by definition another negation called strong negation, perfectly defined, that has all the properties of classical negation. And so, from a point of view, paraconsistent logics are subsystems of classical logic, because some rules and results of classical logic are not valid in paraconsistent logic. But from another approach, classical logic is a sub-logic of paraconsistent logics, because in the good paraconsistent logics, in general, you can define a negation, a defined operator that behaves as the classical negation. And so, according to this negation, every classical formula involving negation is also valid. And then you can approach to paraconsistent logic, to the good paraconsistent logics, as extensions of classical logic too. Have I answered you? Have I replied you?
Yes, I wonder, I once read that there are slight differences between the principle of non-contradiction, bivalence, the principle of bivalence, and the principle of excluded middle. So I guess one of them, you would indeed say it's P or not P, or P and not P. Could you say what, how could you summarize the position of paraconsistent logic? You say it doesn't accept the principle of excluded middle, so maybe that would be not P and not P. No, so that you actually don't accept it, so it would be not P.
It's not the case of P and not P.
Yeah, something like this.
In paraconsistent logics, the principle of non-contradiction.
So it could be this, not P and not P.
Yes. In paraconsistent logics, in general, the principle of non-contradiction, it's not the case, not P and not P and not P is not valid in general. And on account of this, the ex falso is not valid when you deal with the logics. In intuitionistic logics, paracomplete logics, the principle of excluded middle, A or not A, is not valid in general. And that we have some works showing that this kind of logics are duals.
And then could you say that paraconsistent logic is more consistent or less consistent than classical logic?
No, it's paraconsistent. It's aside consistent. It's beyond consistency.
Yeah,
From
so
a certain kind of point, so from a certain point of view, we can consider it as having a kern of consistent formulas, the well-behaved formulas.
mm-hmm.
But from a general meta point of view, they are beyond consistency. They can deal with contradiction without trivialization. That's the question. In classical logics, or in theories based on classical logics, intuitionistic logic, for instance, if you have one contradiction, it's not necessary to have two contradictions. The system explodes. Everything is provable, it's theorem. And so there is no sense to work with this kind of systems. If you use paraconsistent logic, S, from a contradiction in general, you don't have trivialization of the system. It's possible for you to deal with contradictory systems, with contradictory information, with contradictory steps in a scientific research without dying, without trivializing your reasoning. That's the question. And the link consistent is very beautiful, I think.
Yeah, but what paper could I best read for the axioms?
Okay, we can send you. Some inclusive very simple logics of inconsistent logic, some three-valued logics, etc.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are already the time of the lecture of Professor Evandro Gomes. So thank you, Itala and Evandro Gomes. And profesor Agassi, no sé si usted va a hacer su ponencia en castellano o en inglés.
Bueno, para mí es igual. Muy bien, gracias. Sí. No, en este momento me encuentro en Italia, entonces mi idioma más cotidiano es el italiano, pero no es un idioma del meeting, entonces yo puedo presentarlo en español porque al final de la cuenta estamos conectados con Lima, ¿no? Que es de habla hispana. Puedo hablar tranquilamente en español. Si hay gente que no le gusta escuchar en español, puedo hablar en inglés. En portugués lo puedo entender, pero no lo hablo bien.
Evandro, acá es Itala. Hola, sí. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo estás, Itala? Ay, Peter.
Yeah.
Oye que no comprendes castellano. Si podéis hablar en inglés. No.
Bueno, entonces, ¿qué prefieren? ¿El español o el inglés?
English.
Okay, so I'll try to speak English. Now, I don't know whether you need to make a break or not, because we had you had a lecture, a discussion, and then you deserve having a short break. But it is a question which depends on the chairman of the meeting. So
So let's have a 10 minutes break.
10-minute break, okay, because without this break, the concentration might be difficult.
Okay.
Correct. So we can speak right now if you want. More informally, I mean.
Hablé sin sonido. Luis Felipe, Andrés, Fuentes, que hablan inglés. Las cartas y la correspondencia de Miró, Quesada y Newton no es muy bonita.
Sí. Bueno, en realidad yo solo he tenido el gusto de leer esa carta, porque acá no tenemos archivo de las cartas de Miró Quesada con Da Costa. O si lo tenemos, no se sabe dónde está o está muy restringido. Pero esa carta es muy bonita. esa carta es, yo me enamoré cuando la leí de
Sí,
esa carta.
de una belleza, de una cultura, de una visión increíble. Y también la entrevista que nos dio Newton, cuando habla que Quesada actuó como un mágico, un milagro, es tan bonito, me pareció muy lindo. Y es importante porque eso va a aparecer en nuestro paper, porque nos dio mucho trabajo encontrar todo eso. Va a aparecer en el paper, en el libro, en homenaje que están organizando ustedes, pero va a aparecer en inglés en nuestro libro también. Creo que es muy importante que sea divulgado,